In this video, we're going to explore the meaning and application of rule number 1. As Bowen and Spear originally wrote, that rule is all work should be highly specified as to content, sequence, timing, and outcome. Now that's very descriptive of what we're trying to accomplish, but it certainly is an awful lot to remember and internalize. I prefer to summarize that in language that you could probably see yourself using in everyday conversations. Structure every activity. Once we understand what structure every activity means, we can use that on an everyday basis, from problem solving to improvements to just finding the next chance to get better. We have activities all around us. It might be doing a task, making a decision, even doing creative work. They involve how do we interview a candidate? How do we determine what candidate we want to hire? How do we determine what criteria we want to use to hire that candidate? All of those are tasks or activities within the process of interviewing and hiring. We have to examine the activities around us, and each one has an opportunity to have Rule 1 applied, structure every activity. When we say structure every activity, we're talking about defining the content, the sequence, and the timing of how that activity is performed, and also the outcome that you expect. I strongly recommend starting with defining the outcome because it has a huge impact on how you design the activity itself. For example, if you're putting together a puzzle, you don't care how many mistakes you make along the way as long as it looks right in the end. If you're solving a problem with a nuclear reactor, you care very much about making mistakes along the way. Defining the outcome gives us two things. One, it helps us define the right content, sequence, and timing of our activity. And two, it helps us evaluate whether we're getting the result we expect every time we perform that activity. Why is it so important and valuable to have the structured activity? Well, let's imagine we get an outcome different than what we expect. We didn't get a good result. If we don't have a structured activity, what do we go back to get a different result? We can't go back to the structured activity because it doesn't exist. All that's left to go back to is the person. And that's where blame comes from in the organization. If I can't blame the activity, I have to blame the person. And so that's where much of that blame comes from. So we ask that person to try harder and be more careful. But that only works if they weren't being careful to begin with. Being more careful doesn't dramatically change the result. If we have a structured activity and we get an outcome different than what we expect, we can go back and ask questions about our activity. First, did we actually follow the activity the way it's designed? Did we follow the standard? Maybe the reason we didn't follow the standard is we didn't understand it. Maybe we didn't have the information we need, the tools that we need, the time that we needed. There might be a very legitimate reason, but if we didn't follow the activity the way it's designed, of course, we're not going to get the result we expect. And if I did do the activity the way it's designed, our next question then is, what's wrong with the design? I did the activity, it produced a result different than what I expect. Let's go back and examine the content, sequence, and timing so that we can redesign that activity to get the result we expect every time. When most people hear about structuring every activity, they think I can't have another standard. There's only so much bureaucracy you can add to me. And that fundamentally misses the point. We're not talking about adding 3-ring binders and NOR databases for people to comb through. If you design your standards for the user, you avoid all of that. If you pull up to an intersection, you don't have to open a 3-ring binder or open a database to find out who has the right of way. There's a very simple standard. There's a stop sign, there's a stoplight, and it helps us very clearly for the user structure the activity. So we don't need bureaucracy. If we design our activities for the user, we can achieve structuring every activity in a user-friendly way. The other challenge people have with structuring every activity is that they believe it doesn't apply to their work. They understand how it applies to people assembling components in a factory or installing elements into a house. They don't understand how it applies to their creative, variable work. But if you already have variation in the work environment you have, why would you want to add more by not having a structured activity for your contribution? For example, I conduct coaching conversations with much of the work that I do. Now, coaching conversations involves many variables, from the person's mood to the time that we have, to their experience, to the topic itself. But I have structured activities and standard work for how I have that coaching conversation. Now, because of that environment of variation, I may only get to apply that specifically 20% of the time. But every single deviation I have, I understand where I deviated in that activity and the consequences of the result. So I can identify the deviation, I can understand the consequences of the deviation, and I can recover back to what I know I need to do to get the result that I want. Structuring every activity does not mean rigidity. In many cases, it enables flexibility while also achieving good results. So it doesn't matter what our work is, structuring every activity can apply to that work.